Hello, my name is Alyssa Kim, and my final project is on the carbon footprint of beef and some impactful solutions that we as individuals and consumers can take to combat the devastating toll that beef has had on our planet. According to the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, animal agriculture is responsible for 14.5% of global greenhouse gas emissions, with roughly two-thirds of those emissions coming from beef and dairy cattle. In the coming slides, you'll see that most of these greenhouse gas emissions is attributed to agriculture practices and land use for farming. Pictured here is a cattle and farm pasture in the Amazon rainforest with smoke from deforestation in the background. The climate impact of beef is partly down to the biology of how these animals digest food. Cows are ruminants, meaning that their stomachs contain specialized bacteria capable of digesting tough and fibrous material, such as grass. The digestive process causes the animals to belch out methane, a greenhouse gas that is around 28 to 34 times more powerful than CO2 over a 100-year period. Additionally, cows take longer to grow and reproduce, meaning that the production of beef requires much more feed and land than other types of meat. The conversion of land for beef production and animal feed is a leading cause of deforestation in many tropical regions, including in the Amazon, where a recent spike in forest fires and clearing has been linked to cattle ranching, as shown in the photo on my previous slide. One factor to take into account for beef greenhouse gas emissions is whether it's sourced from a dairy herd, where the cattle also produce milk, or a herd dedicated to beef production. Just under half of the world's beef comes from the dairy sector, and it produces 60% lower emissions because its footprint is shared with dairy co-products. This graph here separates carbon footprint by stage of supply chain. As you can see, not only is beef agriculture the largest contributing factor for global greenhouse gas emissions, but most of its carbon footprint comes from the land use and farming area. I will note here that this is referring to a beef herd, which I stated in my previous slide is dedicated to beef production. A few rows below, you can see greenhouse gas emissions from beef produced from a dairy herd. Later in my presentation, I will address the transport category, shown here in red, and how little its emissions is compared to the rest of the beef life cycle. Yet a lot of what we're told as consumers is emphasized on eating local. Here is another busy-looking chart, but I've outlined in orange the main takeaways. On the left, you'll see that half of the world's habitable, ice and desert-free, land is used for agriculture. And on the right, 94% of mammal biomass, excluding humans, is livestock. This means livestock outweigh wild mammals by a factor of 15 to 1. Based on research, there are some actions that we as individuals can take, despite feeling powerless or hopeless amidst the meat industry. While becoming a vegan may be a drastic change for some, being mindful of our consumption and food waste is something we can all do that will still make an impact. Here is a chart displaying greenhouse gas savings potential from the global adoption of various diets. For sake of this discussion, I'm focusing on vegan and vegetarian diets outlined in orange at the top. This chart displays the total amount of greenhouse gases that could be saved each year by 2050 if the world were to adopt each of these diets when compared to a business as usual scenario for 2050. The business as usual scenario is based on projections of continued population growth and rising meat intake from the Food and Agriculture Organization in 2012. The analysis shows that a global switch to veganism would deliver the largest emissions savings out of any dietary shift, saving almost 8 billion tons of CO2 equivalents a year by 2050. For vegetarianism, the effect is still great, and I will add that in this study, vegetarian is defined as 1 serving of meat or seafood per month. Although it is still too early to say how plant-based meats could affect future emissions, so far, based off of production, there are massive differences in the greenhouse gas emissions between red meat and plant-based meat. The chart shows that the carbon footprints of both the Beyond Burger and the Impossible Burger are around 20 times smaller than that produced by the same amount of beef. It's estimated that the average American household's food emissions were around 8 tons of CO2 equivalents per year. Food transport accounted for only 5% of this, or 0.4 tons of CO2 equivalents. A 2008 study investigated the relative climate impact of food miles and food choices in households in the US. The analysis showed that substituting 1 day per week's worth of calories from beef and dairy products to chicken, fish, eggs, or a plant-based alternative reduces more greenhouse gas emissions than buying all your food from local sources. If the average household substituted their calories from red meat and dairy to chicken, fish, or eggs just 1 day per week, they would save 0.3 tons of CO2 equivalents. If they replaced it with plant-based alternatives, they would save 0.46 tons of CO2 equivalents. Simply put, going red meat and dairy-free 1 day per week would achieve the same as having a diet with 0 food miles. Food waste is responsible for 8% of global greenhouse gas emissions. That's 4 times the global emissions from aviation. Almost 1/4 of the calories the world produces are thrown away. They're spoiled or spilled in supply chains, or are wasted by retailers, restaurants, and consumers. To produce this food, we need land, water, energy, and fertilizer inputs. It all comes at an environmental cost. The biggest proportion of food waste, about 37%, happens in the home. I too have been guilty of aspirationally buying ingredients that I'm not able to cook, or I didn't even see it in my crowded refrigerator. Perishables go bad quickly if they're improperly stored, and misunderstanding date labels causes people to throw away foods prematurely. Consider getting perishable goods from farmers markets or local greengrocers. If food is produced locally, it's usually fresher and won't go bad as fast. If there's absolutely no way to rescue an item, for example, my slimy spinach, composting can limit the environmental impact of tossing it. When food rots in a landfill, it produces huge amounts of methane, a greenhouse gas that is at least 28 times as potent as carbon dioxide. But in compost bins, microbes convert that organic matter into nutrient-rich soil, keeping the carbon out of the atmosphere and producing valuable fertilizer. My last point here, talk it up. Awareness of food waste is a good first step. According to ReFed, a nonprofit dedicated to reducing food waste, educating consumers about food waste could prevent 7.41 million tons of greenhouse gas emissions. To combat the climate crisis from not just a red meat but overall food perspective, we will need a menu of solutions. Changes to diets, food waste reduction, improvements in agricultural efficiency, and technologies to make low-carbon food alternatives scalable and affordable. I hope this presentation on carbon footprint of meat was informative and you were able to take away some pointers for you and yours. Thank you.